Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into a question that feels both deeply personal and strangely vast. Where is your mind, really? But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a gentle reminder of how many different lives in different moments can share the same quiet space together. Now, feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft, steady hum, and let your body begin to rest. There's nothing you need to solve tonight, nothing you need to remember perfectly. This is not a lecture. It's more like a slow walk through an idea, one that might drift in and out of focus as your mind gently wanders. And if your thoughts begin to soften or slip away entirely, that's perfectly fine. Let them go. The story will continue quietly, whether you follow every word or not, because tonight we're exploring something that may feel a little unusual at first. What if your mind isn't inside your brain at all? And with that thought, we can begin. There is a very natural assumption that most of us carry without ever needing to question it. Your mind is in your head. It feels obvious, almost too obvious to examine. If you point to where your thoughts seem to happen, where your memories live, where your sense of you feels strongest, your hand will probably drift toward your skull without hesitation. Somewhere behind your eyes, perhaps slightly above and inward, there seems to be a quiet center, a place where experience gathers. And from childhood, everything reinforces this idea. You learn that the brain controls the body, that neurons send signals, that different parts of the brain are responsible for vision, for language, for emotion. You might even see diagrams, colourful maps of the brain, with neat labels showing where things happen. And slowly, without anyone needing to say it directly, a picture forms. The brain produces the mind lives inside the brain, and the brain lives inside your head. It is clean, it is intuitive, it feels complete. But there is something quietly strange about it, because if you pause for just a moment and notice your own experience right now, something doesn't quite fit. You are aware, not as an idea, but as something immediate. There is a soft presence of experience, the feeling of hearing these words, of sensing your body resting, of thoughts gently forming and dissolving. This awareness does not feel like an object. It doesn't feel like something you could point to in the same way you point to a chair or a table. It feels more like a space, or perhaps not even a space, but the possibility of space, the open field in which everything else appears. Now here is the gentle question. Where exactly is that? Not your brain, not the physical structure inside your skull, but the experience itself, the feeling of being aware, the quiet sense of I am here. If you try to locate it precisely, something curious happens. It seems to slip. You might say it's behind your eyes, but when you look carefully, what you actually find are sensations, pressure, warmth, subtle flickers of light and shadow. You might say it's in your head, but your head itself is something you perceive. It appears within your experience just like everything else. So how can the container of experience also be something inside the experience? It's a bit like trying to find the edge of a mirror from within the reflection, or like asking where, inside a song, the music itself is located. The notes have positions, the instruments have sources, but the music, the feeling of it, the flow of it, doesn't sit neatly in one place. It emerges as a whole, something more than the sum of its parts. And perhaps very gently, this is where the familiar picture begins to soften, because the idea that your mind is inside your brain depends on something deeper, something we rarely question. It assumes that consciousness is the kind of thing that can be located in space, that it makes sense to ask where it is, in the same way we ask where a book is, or where a cup is, or where the moon is in the night sky. But what if that assumption is not quite right? What if consciousness is not an object at all? What if it is not something that sits somewhere, but something that allows somewhere to appear in the first place? This may sound abstract at first, but you can feel your way into it. Imagine you're watching a film. On the screen there are characters, landscapes, movement, distance. A city stretches across the horizon. A person walks from one side of the frame to the other. Everything seems to exist in a clear, structured space. Now ask yourself, where is that space? Not the physical screen, not the pixels, but the space you experience inside the story. You cannot point to it. You cannot isolate it. It is not located in any single part of the screen, and yet, without it, nothing in the film would make sense. It is the stage on which everything else appears, and in a very quiet way, your own experience may be similar. Your thoughts, your sensations, your memories, they all appear somewhere. There is a sense of depth, of distance, of location. But the awareness in which they appear does not seem to follow the same rules. It does not have edges. It does not have a clear boundary. It does not sit neatly inside a coordinate system. And this leads us to a possibility that is both subtle and profound. The question, where is your mind, might not have an answer, not because we haven't found it yet, but because the question itself may be built on the wrong kind of assumption. It may be like asking, where is the colour red located? Or, where is the meaning of a sentence stored inside the ink? We can trace the physical processes. We can point to wavelengths, to neurons, to patterns of activity. But the experience itself, the redness, the meaning, the feeling, does not behave like a physical object. It doesn't have an address. And so, very gently, we begin to loosen our grip on the idea that your mind must be somewhere inside your head, not rejecting it, not replacing it yet, just holding it a little more lightly. Because as we continue, we'll see that modern science, from neuroscience to physics, has uncovered something quietly unsettling. The brain and the mind are deeply connected in ways that are precise, measurable, and undeniable. And yet, that connection may not mean what we think it means. For now, you can simply rest with the question, not trying to solve it, just noticing how it feels, the sense that your experience is here, but not quite located, present, but not confined, like a soft light that fills a room without belonging to any single corner. And as that thought settles, we can begin to look more closely at the brain itself and the remarkable patterns of activity that seem to move so closely alongside the mind, like shadows dancing with light. As that quiet question lingers, where your mind really is, we can gently turn our attention to something much more familiar, the brain. Because whatever else may be true, there is no denying that the brain and the mind move together in a remarkably precise dance. Inside your skull, there is a structure weighing a little over a kilogram, soft and delicate, yet endlessly complex. It is made of billions of tiny cells called neurons. Each one is capable of sending small electrical signals like whispers of energy, passing messages to thousands of other neurons. If you could see it in motion, not as a static image in a textbook, but as a living system, you might imagine something like a vast city at night. Lights flickering on and off, pathways glowing briefly, then fading, signals travelling in intricate patterns, looping, branching, converging. Every thought you have, every memory, every sensation is accompanied by these shifting patterns of activity. When you see something, a cup on a table, or the soft glow of a screen, light enters your eyes and is converted into electrical signals. These signals travel along pathways into the back of your brain, where certain regions become active. If you feel a gentle warmth in your hands, another network responds. If you recall a memory, a different pattern emerges. And over time, scientists have mapped many of these relationships with astonishing precision. Damage a particular region of the brain, and a specific ability may change or disappear. A person might lose the ability to recognize faces, even though their vision remains intact. Another might lose the ability to form new memories, while still recalling events from long ago. If certain chemicals in the brain are altered, the entire tone of experience can shift. A small change in the balance of neurotransmitters, the tiny molecules that help neurons communicate, can transform how the world feels. Colours may seem brighter or dimmer, thoughts may race or slow, emotions may lift or deepen. And when doctors administer anesthesia, substances that gently disrupt the normal patterns of brain activity, something very striking happens. Experience itself fades, not gradually, but almost like a dimmer switch being turned down. Awareness softens, fragments, and then disappears into a kind of quiet absence. From the outside, the conclusion seems almost unavoidable. The brain produces the mind. It feels like the most natural explanation. After all, if changing the brain changes experience, then surely the brain must be the source of that experience. And for many people, including many scientists, this is where the story ends. But if we stay here just a little longer, something subtle begins to emerge. Because what we have just described, carefully, accurately, is a set of correlations. When the brain changes, the mind changes. When activity increases in one region, a certain experience appears. When activity is disrupted, that experience disappears. The connection is real. It is consistent. It is deeply reliable. But there is a quiet step in the reasoning that often goes unnoticed. We move from correlation to causation. We assume that because two things move together, one must be producing the other. And most of the time, in everyday life, that assumption works beautifully. If you flip a light switch and the room becomes illuminated, it is natural to say that the switch caused the light. If you press a key on a piano and hear a note, it feels obvious that the key created the sound. But even in these simple cases, the relationship is a little more layered than it first appears. The switch does not create light from nothing. It allows an existing flow of electrical energy to pass through a circuit. The piano key does not create sound on its own. It sets a string into motion which vibrates the air, which reaches your ears. In both cases, there is a deeper system at work, something already present, being shaped or directed. And this brings us back very gently to the brain. What if the brain is not creating consciousness, but shaping it? What if it is less like a generator and more like a kind of instrument? Imagine, for a moment, a radio. When you turn the dial, the sound changes. Music becomes speech. Speech becomes static. Static becomes silence. If the radio is damaged, the sound may distort or disappear entirely. From the outside, it might seem as though the radio is producing the music. But of course, the music is not inside the radio. It is being received, filtered, translated, made audible through the structure of the device. And the fact that changing the radio changes the sound does not mean the radio is the source. It means the radio is the interface. Now, this is only an analogy. It is not proof of anything. but it opens a small space in our thinking, a possibility that the relationship between brain and mind might be more subtle than it first appears, because even with all our knowledge of neurons and signals, there is still something that remains unexplained. We can describe in extraordinary detail what happens in the brain when you see a colour. Light of a certain wavelength reaches your eyes. Specialised cells respond. Signals travel through pathways into the brain. Patterns of activity emerge. But at the end of that description, there is still a question. Why does it feel like anything at all? Why is there a soft, vivid experience of redness instead of nothing? Why does the processing of information become a lived experience? This is the place where the neat, intuitive picture begins to loosen. Because no matter how detailed the description becomes, no matter how precisely we map every signal and every connection, there remains a gap between the physical activity and the experience itself. It is like describing every note in a piece of music, every vibration of air, every movement of a speaker, and still not having captured what it feels like to hear it. The warmth of a melody, the quiet pull of a memory, the subtle sense of meaning. Something is there that is not easily reduced to the mechanics, and this is not a failure of effort. It is not because we have not studied the brain carefully enough. It may be pointing to something deeper, a limitation not in our data, but in the way we are framing the question. Because if consciousness was simply something the brain produces, then in principle a complete description of the brain should also be a complete description of experience. But it doesn't seem to be, and this is where our journey begins to deepen. We're no longer just asking where the mind is located. We're beginning to ask a more delicate question. What kind of thing is consciousness really? Is it something that can be built piece by piece from physical processes? Or is it something more fundamental, something that the brain interacts with rather than creates? For now, there is no need to choose an answer. You can simply notice the tension, the undeniable connection between brain and mind, and the equally undeniable mystery of experience itself. Two truths, resting side by side, like the steady rhythm of your breathing and the quiet awareness that notices it. And as we sit with that gentle contradiction, we can begin to explore the idea that has puzzled philosophers and scientists for decades, the possibility that even a perfect understanding of the brain might still leave something essential unexplained. As that quiet tension settles in, the sense that the brain and the mind are deeply connected, yet not fully explained by one another, we can move a little deeper into the question. There is a term introduced by the philosopher David Chalmers that gently captures this mystery. He called it the hard problem of consciousness. At first, the phrase might sound dramatic, as if it belongs to a particularly difficult exam or an unsolved puzzle in a textbook. But in reality, it points to something much closer, something you encounter every moment without needing to think about it. To understand it, it helps to begin with what Chalmers called the easy problems, and despite the name, they are not truly easy. These are the kinds of questions that science is very good at asking, and slowly, very good at answering. How does the brain process information from the senses? How does it combine sight and sound into a single experience? How does it store memories, guide behaviour, shift attention? These are intricate questions. They require careful experiments, advanced imaging, and years of study. But they all share something in common. They're about function. They ask how the system works. And for these kinds of questions, we can imagine a future where the answers become increasingly complete, where every pathway is mapped, every signal understood, every mechanism described in detail. But then, there is another question, a quieter one. Why does any of this feel like anything at all? when light reaches your eyes and your brain processes it, why is there an experience of colour? When your skin senses warmth, why is there a feeling of warmth? When thoughts arise in your mind, why do they appear as something you are aware of, instead of simply happening in silence? This is the hard problem, not how the brain processes information, but why that processing is accompanied by experience, why there is something it is like to be you. You can imagine, if you like, a very detailed scientific description of a moment. It might go something like this. Photons, tiny packets of light, reach the retina. They trigger chemical changes in specialized cells. Signals travel along neural pathways into the brain. Patterns of activity emerge in regions responsible for visual processing. Every step is precise, measurable, elegant. But at the end of that description, something is still missing. The experience. The simple, immediate sense of seeing. The soft glow of colour. The quiet presence of awareness. It is not that science is wrong. Everything in the description is accurate. It is that the description seems to leave something out, something essential. And what makes this problem so unusual is that adding more detail does not seem to solve it. You could make the description more and more complete. You could map every neuron, every connection, every tiny fluctuation in electrical activity. You could describe the entire system down to the smallest level, and still the question would remain. Why does it feel like anything? It is as if there is a gap. Not a gap in knowledge that we can fill with more data, but a gap between two kinds of description. On one side, we have the physical story. Signals, structures, processes. On the other side, we have the lived experience, the feeling of being here, and the two do not seem to fully meet. To make this a little more tangible, imagine listening to a piece of music. You could describe the sound in terms of vibrations in the air. You could measure the frequencies, the amplitudes, the patterns over time. You could even describe how your ear transforms those vibrations into electrical signals and how your brain processes them. All of that would be true, but none of it would capture what it feels like to hear the music. The gentle rise of a melody, the way a certain chord seems to linger, the quiet emotion that comes and goes, sometimes without a clear reason. That experience is not contained in the physical description. And this is what makes the hard problem so persistent. It does not disappear as our understanding improves. It remains quietly waiting, no matter how detailed the explanation becomes. Some thinkers have suggested that the problem might not be with consciousness, but with the way we're trying to explain it, that perhaps we're using the wrong kind of tools, because the language of physics, the language of measurements, positions, interactions, is designed to describe things from the outside. It tells us how systems behave, but consciousness is known from the inside. It is not something we observe from a distance, it is something we are. And so, there may be a mismatch. We are trying to explain something deeply internal, using a framework built for describing external structure, like trying to describe the taste of honey using only the geometry of its molecules, or trying to capture the feeling of warmth using only the motion of particles. The description is not wrong, it is simply incomplete, and this leads to a quiet but important realization. The assumption that consciousness can be fully explained in terms of physical processes may not be as secure as it first appears. Not because the brain is irrelevant, it clearly matters, but because the relationship between physical processes and experience might be more subtle than simple cause and effect. This is why the hard problem has remained unsolved, despite decades of research. It is not for lack of effort. It is because the problem sits at the boundary of how we understand reality itself. And as we move forward, this boundary will begin to widen, because once we accept that experience cannot be easily reduced to physical description, another question naturally follows. If consciousness is not fully explained by the brain, then what is it? Is it something that emerges from complexity, like a pattern forming in a flowing river? Is it something fundamental like space or time? Or is it something else entirely? Something that does not fit neatly into any category we're used to? There is no need to answer yet. You can simply let the question rest, like a ripple spreading across still water, because in the next step of our journey, we will explore a simple thought experiment, one that gently reveals just how deep this mystery goes. A story about a scientist who knew everything about colour, and yet had never seen it. There is a simple story, often told in quiet corners of philosophy, that has a way of lingering long after you hear it. It begins with a scientist named Mary. Mary is not just any scientist. She is brilliant, patient, and deeply curious about the nature of the mind. Over many years, she's learned everything there is to know about how the brain processes colour. She understands, in perfect detail, how light interacts with the eyes, how signals travel through the nervous system, and how patterns of activity in the brain correspond to what we call seeing. But there is something unusual about Mary's life. She has spent all of it inside a room where everything is black and white. The walls are shades of grey. The objects around her, books, instruments, even the food she eats, are all without colour. She has never seen a blue sky, a green leaf, or a red apple. Not because she lacks the ability, but because her entire world has been carefully arranged to exclude colour entirely. And yet, despite this limitation, Mary knows everything there is to know about colour in a scientific sense. She knows that what we call red corresponds to light with a certain range of wavelengths. She knows how that light stimulates specific cells in the retina. She understands how signals move through pathways in the brain and how they lead to recognition, language, and behaviour. If there were a textbook on colour vision, Mary would have written it. Now, imagine that one day, the door to her room opens. For the first time, Mary steps outside, and there, waiting for her, is something simple, a red apple. She looks at it, and in that moment, something new happens. She sees red. The question is very gentle, but also very deep. Does Mary learn something new? At first, it might seem like the answer should be no. After all, she already knew everything about colour, every physical detail, every scientific explanation. There was nothing left to discover, at least in theory. And yet, when she sees the apple, it feels unmistakably different. There is something in the experience itself that was not present in all her knowledge before. The vividness of the colour, the quiet immediacy of it, the simple, undeniable sense of this is what red looks like. It is not just information. It is a kind of knowing that feels closer, more direct. Almost like stepping into a room you've only seen on a map. You knew the layout, you knew the dimensions, but being there is different. And this difference is what the thought experiment is trying to reveal. Because if Mary truly knew every physical fact about colour before leaving the room and still learned something new when she experienced it, then it suggests something important. That physical knowledge, no matter how complete, may not capture everything. There may be aspects of reality, specifically the qualities of experience, that are not fully contained in physical descriptions. Philosophers sometimes use a quiet word for this. They call it qualia. It simply refers to the felt qualities of experience, the redness of red, the warmth of warmth, the gentle softness of a memory, not the signals, not the processes, but the way it feels from the inside. And Mary's story suggests that these qualities are not easily reduced to facts about neurons, signals, or patterns of activity. they seem to be something more. Now, not everyone agrees with this conclusion. Some have argued that Mary does not gain new knowledge, but rather a new ability. The ability to recognize red. The ability to imagine it. The ability to remember it. And this is a thoughtful response. It reminds us to be careful, not to jump too quickly from intuition to conclusion. But even with this perspective, something remains. Because when Mary sees red for the first time, there is an experience, a moment of awareness that was not present before, and that experience itself, the simple fact that it feels like something, is not easily described in terms of ability. It is not about what she can do, it is about what is happening. And this brings us back gently to the heart of our exploration. Because if there are aspects of experience that cannot be captured by physical knowledge alone, then the idea that consciousness is simply produced by the brain becomes a little less certain, not necessarily wrong, but incomplete. It suggests that the relationship between the brain and experience may not be as straightforward as we once thought, that there may be layers we have not yet fully understood. You can think of it perhaps like reading a recipe. A recipe can tell you everything about how to prepare a dish, the ingredients, the steps, the timing. It can be perfectly accurate, perfectly detailed. But reading the recipe is not the same as tasting the food. There is a difference between description and experience, and no matter how detailed the description becomes, that difference remains. Mary's room is a quiet reminder of that difference. It does not tell us exactly what consciousness is, but it gently shows us what it might not be. It might not be something that can be fully captured by physical facts alone. And if that is true, then we find ourselves in a very interesting position. Because the brain, as far as we can tell, is a physical system. It is made of cells, chemicals, and electrical activity. And yet the experiences associated with it, your thoughts, your sensations, your sense of being, seem to include something that goes beyond purely physical description. Two sides, once again, resting together, the measurable and the felt. And as we hold both of these gently in mind, the question begins to shift. It is no longer just, where is the mind? It becomes, what kind of thing is the mind? If knowing everything about the brain still leaves something out. And from here, the path leads naturally into an even deeper layer of the mystery. Because what Mary's story suggests is not just a gap in neuroscience. It may be a gap in our entire understanding of the physical world, a quiet space where even the most complete scientific description still cannot quite reach. And that is where our journey continues. As Mary steps out of her quiet, colourless room and sees that first red apple, something gentle but profound begins to unfold. Not just a question about the brain, but a question about reality itself. Because if knowing every physical detail is not enough to capture experience, then the mystery may go deeper than neuroscience. It may reach into the very foundations of how we describe the world. And this is where our journey takes a slightly wider view. For a long time, there has been a comforting idea in science that if we could just understand the physical world completely, if we could describe every particle, every interaction, every pattern of energy, then, in principle, we would understand everything. This imagined understanding is sometimes called a theory of everything. Not a literal phrase we need to hold tightly, but a way of pointing toward a complete description of the physical universe, a set of principles that explains how everything behaves, from the smallest particles to the largest galaxies. And it is a beautiful idea. The universe, described with elegance and precision, unfolding according to clear and consistent patterns. But here is the quiet question that begins to appear. Even if we had such a complete description, would it tell us why anything feels like anything? Imagine for a moment that we had reached that level of understanding. We know how space behaves. We know how time flows. We know how matter interacts, how energy moves, how every system evolves. We could describe the brain in perfect detail. Every neuron, every connection, every signal mapped completely. Now ask the same question again. Why does it feel like anything to be that system? Why is there experience at all? And something remarkable happens. The question does not go away. It remains quietly present, no matter how complete the physical description becomes. This is what some philosophers have called the explanatory gap, a gentle but persistent distance between two ways of describing the world. On one side, there is the language of physics. It tells us how things behave. It gives us relationships, patterns, and structures. It describes how one event leads to another, how systems evolve over time. On the other side, there is the language of experience, the feeling of warmth, the colour of the sky, the quiet sense of being aware. And no matter how far we extend the first kind of description, it does not seem to fully reach the second. It is as if we are describing the shape of a flame, without ever touching the warmth. Now, it is important to be gentle here. This is not a failure of science. Science is extraordinarily successful at what it is designed to do. It gives us reliable knowledge about the structure and behaviour of the world. It allows us to predict, to build, to understand patterns that would otherwise remain hidden. But it may be that the tools of science, at least as they are currently used, are focused on a particular aspect of reality, the external, the measurable, the structural. And consciousness, in contrast, is known from the inside. It is immediate, direct, and not easily translated into measurements or equations. To make this a little clearer, imagine trying to describe a piece of music purely in terms of its structure. You could say that certain notes follow others. You could describe the rhythm, the timing, the relationships between frequencies. You could even write it down in a precise system of notation. All of that would be accurate, but it would not fully capture what it feels like to hear the music, the sense of movement, the emotional tone, the way it seems to unfold in time. That aspect of the experience is not contained in the structure alone, and in a similar way, the physical description of the universe may capture its structure without capturing its inner character. This idea was noticed long ago by thinkers like Bertrand Russell, who suggested something very simple but very deep. Physics tells us how things behave, but it does not tell us what things are in themselves. It describes relationships, how one thing affects another, how systems change over time, but it remains silent on the intrinsic nature of those things. What is an electron really? Not how it moves, not how it interacts, but what it is in its own right. Physics gives us equations, patterns, and predictions, but the inside of those patterns, the qualitative aspect, is left open. And this is where the connection to consciousness becomes especially interesting, because consciousness is, in a sense, all about the inside. It is what things feel like from within. So one possibility, just a possibility held gently, is that the gap we are noticing is not a problem to be solved by adding more detail. It may be pointing to something missing in the framework itself, that the way we currently describe reality captures only one side of it, the outer structure, but not the inner experience. And if that is true, then the relationship between brain and mind becomes even more intriguing. Because the brain, as far as we know, is part of the physical world. It follows the same patterns, the same principles, and yet the experiences associated with it seem to belong to this other side, the side of inner feeling. It is as if the brain sits at a meeting point, where structure and experience come together, where the outer description and the inner reality touch without fully merging. And this may be why the problem feels so persistent, because we are not simply missing a piece of information. We may be looking at two different aspects of reality, using tools designed for only one of them. This does not mean we need to abandon science. Far from it. It simply suggests that our understanding may need to expand, to include not only how things behave, but what they are like. And as this idea begins to take shape, another question quietly emerges. If consciousness is not fully explained by physical structure, then perhaps it is not something that arises from structure at all. Perhaps it is something more fundamental, something that is present in some form at the very base of reality, not as a product, but as a starting point. This idea may feel unfamiliar at first, but as we continue, we will explore it gently, step by step, not as a conclusion to accept, but as a possibility to consider. For now, you can simply rest with the sense that the mystery is deeper than it first appeared, that even the most complete map of the physical world might still leave something untouched, something quiet, something immediate, something that, right now, is simply here. As the idea of a quiet gap settles in, the sense that even a complete description of the physical world might leave something out, we can return gently to the question that started our journey. Where is your mind? It sounds like such a simple question, almost innocent, the kind of question you might answer without thinking. In my head. And yet, as we've begun to see, that answer rests on a deeper assumption. That consciousness is the kind of thing that can be located, that it exists somewhere in space, the way a book rests on a table or a lamp sits in a corner of a room. But what if that assumption is not quite right? What if the mind is not something that occupies a position in space at all? To explore this, it helps to slow down and notice something very immediate. Right now, you're aware of your surroundings. Perhaps you can sense the weight of your body, the softness of the surface beneath you. You might notice faint sounds in the distance or the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. All of these things appear to you somewhere. There is a sense of space, a gentle feeling of here and there, near and far, inside and outside. But now turn your attention slightly. Instead of focusing on what you are aware of, notice the awareness itself, the simple fact that there is experience happening. Where is that located? If you try to point to it, something subtle happens. You might gesture toward your head, but what you find there are sensations, pressure, warmth, perhaps a faint pulsing. These are objects of awareness, things that appear within your experience. But the awareness itself does not seem to sit among them. It is not something you can isolate in the same way. It does not have a shape, or a boundary, or a clear position. It is simply present, like a quiet openness in which everything else appears. This can feel a little strange at first, like trying to look directly at something that is always just out of reach. But it points toward a very gentle possibility. That consciousness might not be in space, in the way we usually think. To make this a little more tangible, imagine you are watching a film. On the screen, there is a world. Characters move through rooms. They walk across landscapes. They travel from one place to another. The space within the film feels real, structured, and consistent. Now ask yourself, where is that space? Not the physical screen, not the pixels, but the space you experience inside the story. You cannot point to it. It is not located in one corner of the screen or another. It is something that emerges from the whole. The arrangement of images, the flow of time, the coherence of the scene, all of these together create the sense of space. But the space itself is not a separate object. It is not something you can hold or measure directly. It is more like a stage, that appears along with everything else. And in a quiet way, your own experience may be similar. The world you perceive feels spatial. Objects seem to have positions. Your body feels located. There is a sense of distance and direction. But the awareness in which all of this appears does not seem to follow the same rules. It is not over there or over here. It does not move from place to place. It is simply the condition in which place itself becomes meaningful. Another way to approach this is to consider something as simple as a thought. A thought appears in your mind, perhaps a memory or a word or a small image. Where is that thought? You might say it is in your head, but again, that is a way of speaking, a kind of shorthand. If you look closely, the thought does not occupy a specific point in space. It does not have coordinates. It arises, lingers for a moment, and then fades, like a ripple on water. Now imagine trying to assign a location to that ripple, not on the surface, but in terms of experience itself. It becomes difficult, almost impossible to pin down. And this difficulty is not a failure. It may be telling us something important. That consciousness, the field in which thoughts, sensations, and perceptions appear, is not the kind of thing that can be placed within a map of space. It may be more fundamental than that. There is a quiet analogy that can help here. Consider the meaning of a sentence. You can point to the words on a page. You can describe the ink, the paper, the shapes of the letters. But the meaning itself, where is it? It is not in any single word, not in any particular letter, not in any specific location on the page. It arises from the whole, from the relationships between parts, from the way everything comes together. And even then, the meaning is not something you can point to. It is something you understand, something that appears within your awareness. In a similar way, consciousness may not be something that exists in a particular place. It may be the context in which place becomes possible. And if that is true, then the question, where is your mind, begins to shift. It is no longer a question about location. It becomes a question about nature. What kind of thing is consciousness if it does not have a position in space? Is it like a field, gently present everywhere? Is it like a process, unfolding without a fixed centre? Or is it something even more subtle, something that does not fit into our usual categories at all? There is no need to decide. You can simply notice how the question itself is changing, from something concrete and familiar into something softer, more open. And as it opens, it makes space for another possibility, that the relationship between mind and brain might not be one of container and contained, not something inside something else, but something more like two sides of a single reality, one seen from the outside as structure and activity, the other known from the inside as experience. And if that is the case, then locating the mind inside the brain may be a bit like trying to locate the melody inside a violin. The instrument matters. Its shape, its strings, its material, all of these influence the sound. But the music itself is not inside the wood. It is something that arises through it. And perhaps, in a similar way, the mind is not something that sits inside the brain. It is something that appears with the brain, something expressed through it, something that, when we try to pin it down to a location, quietly slips beyond our reach, not because it is far away, but because it was never somewhere to begin with. As the idea settles that your mind may not have a clear location, that it may not sit neatly inside your head the way objects sit in space, another question begins to unfold, quietly and naturally. If consciousness is not something we can point to, not something we can locate, then what exactly are we missing when we try to describe it? To explore this, it helps to take a gentle step outward, away from the mind for a moment, and toward the way we describe the physical world itself. Because everything we know about the universe, everything from the motion of planets to the behavior of the smallest particles, comes to us through a particular kind of description, a language of relationships. Physics, at its heart, tells us how things behave. It tells us how objects move, how forces interact, how energy flows. It gives us patterns, rules, and elegant connections between events. If you drop a stone, physics can describe how it falls. If you shine light through a prism, physics can describe how it separates into colours. If you look at the motion of distant stars, physics can describe how they move through space. And it does this with remarkable success. But there is something quietly interesting about this kind of description. It is always about structure, about how one thing relates to another, about patterns that can be measured, compared, and predicted. What it does not seem to describe is what things are like from the inside. To see this more clearly, imagine describing a piece of music purely in terms of structure. You could talk about the timing of the notes, the intervals between them, the changes in frequency. You could map out the entire composition in precise detail, and yet, none of that would capture what it feels like to hear the music, the warmth of a melody, the way a certain passage seems to linger, almost like a memory, the quiet, emotional tone that rises and falls, often without words. All of that belongs to a different kind of knowing, not the structure, but the experience. And this distinction between structure and experience is at the heart of what we're exploring. Because when physics describes the world, it gives us the structure. It tells us how things are arranged, how they interact, how they change, but it remains silent on what those things are, in themselves. This idea was noticed by thinkers like Bertrand Russell, who suggested that our scientific descriptions capture only one side of reality, the outer side, the relational side, but not the intrinsic nature, the inside, so to speak. What is an electron? Physics can tell us how it behaves. It can describe its charge, its mass, its interactions with other particles. But when we ask what it is in its own right, the answer becomes less clear. We are given properties, not essence, relationships, not inner character. And this is not a flaw. It is simply the scope of the method. Physics is designed to describe what can be observed and measured from the outside. But consciousness is not known from the outside. It is known directly from within. And so, we find ourselves with two complementary perspectives, the external description and the internal experience, the structure and the feeling. And the two do not seem to fully overlap. Now, here is where things become quietly intriguing. Because if physics describes only the structure of reality, and consciousness is something that reveals the inner aspect of reality, then perhaps the two are not separate at all. Perhaps they are two views of the same underlying process, one seen from the outside, the other known from the inside. To make this a little more tangible, imagine holding a coin in your hand. On one side there is a pattern, clear, visible, easy to describe. On the other side there is a different pattern, two distinct images but part of the same object. You cannot reduce one side to the other, but you also cannot separate them. They belong together. And in a similar way, the physical and the experiential may be two aspects of a single reality. When we study the brain, we see patterns of activity, signals moving, regions interacting, networks forming and dissolving. This is the structural view. But from the inside, that same process is experienced as thoughts, sensations, emotions. This is the experiential view. And perhaps, rather than one producing the other, they are simply different ways of accessing the same thing. Like looking at a landscape from above, or walking through it on foot. Two perspectives, one reality. This idea can feel surprisingly gentle, because it does not require us to reject what we know about the brain. The brain still matters. Its structure still shapes experience in precise and meaningful ways. Damage the brain, and experience changes, alter its chemistry, and perception shifts. All of that remains true. But instead of saying that the brain creates consciousness, we might say something slightly different. That the brain is the physical appearance of a process that, from the inside, is experienced as consciousness. That your mind is what your brain is, when viewed from within. And this shift, while subtle, has a profound effect on how we think about the problem. It suggests that the gap we've been noticing, the space between physical description and experience, is not something to be filled. It may be something to be understood, a reflection of the fact that we're looking at the same reality in two different ways. And if that is true, then the question is no longer, how does the brain create the mind? But rather, how are these two aspects related? And what do they reveal about the deeper nature of reality? This does not give us a final answer, but it gently changes the shape of the problem from something that feels like a missing piece into something that feels like a hidden connection. And as we continue, this connection will begin to widen. Because once we allow the possibility that consciousness is not something produced by physical structure alone, another idea begins to emerge, one that has been explored in different forms across science and philosophy. The possibility that consciousness is not something that appears only in complex systems like the brain, but something more fundamental, something that may be present in some form throughout the fabric of reality itself. For now, there is no need to decide. You can simply rest with the image, structure on one side, experience on the other, two ways of seeing, two ways of knowing, quietly pointing towards something deeper that we're only just beginning to glimpse. As the idea gently forms that structure and experience might be two sides of the same reality, something else begins to take shape, a kind of crossroads. Because once we accept that the usual explanation, brain creates mind, may not fully resolve the mystery, we are left with a small number of paths forward. Not endless possibilities, but a few distinct ways of understanding what consciousness might be. And it can be helpful at this point to lay them out clearly, not as rigid choices, but as gentle directions we can explore. The first path is perhaps the simplest, at least on the surface. It suggests that consciousness, as we experience it, might not be what we think it is. This view is sometimes called illusionism. It proposes that the feeling of having an inner experience, the sense of colour, warmth, awareness, is not something fundamentally real, but rather a kind of useful appearance created by the brain. According to this perspective, when you feel the redness of red, or the softness of a memory, what is actually happening is a complex process of information handling. The brain is processing signals, categorizing them, responding to them, and in doing so it generates the impression that there is an inner experience. But that impression, the argument goes, is not something extra. It is simply the way the system represents itself, like a dashboard in a car. The dashboard shows speed, fuel, temperature, but it does not contain those things. It presents them in a way that is useful for the driver. In the same way, the brain might present information in a form that feels like experience, without there being anything beyond the processing itself. Now, this idea has a certain elegance. It keeps everything within the physical framework. It avoids introducing anything new or unfamiliar. But it also carries a quiet difficulty, because the very thing it calls an illusion is the one thing we are most certain of. You might doubt many things, the nature of the world, the accuracy of your senses, even the existence of objects around you. But the fact that you are having an experience, that there is something it feels like to be here, is very hard to deny. Calling that an illusion can feel a bit like saying that the light you see is not really light, while still seeing it. And so, while illusionism offers a clean solution, it leaves many people with a sense that something essential has been set aside. The second path moves in a different direction. It suggests that consciousness and the physical world are two fundamentally different kinds of things. This is often referred to as dualism. According to this view, the brain is physical, made of matter and energy, following the laws of nature. But consciousness belongs to a different category. It is not made of the same stuff. It does not follow the same rules. Instead, the two interact in some way. The brain influences the mind, and the mind influences the brain. Like two dancers moving together, each affecting the other, but never fully merging. This idea has a long history. It has an intuitive appeal because it respects the difference we feel between physical processes and inner experience. But it also raises its own questions. How do these two very different kinds of things interact? If the mind is not physical, how does it affect the physical brain? And if the brain changes, why does the mind change in such precise and consistent ways? Dualism preserves the mystery, but it does not fully explain the connection. And so, we arrive at a third path, one that takes a quieter, but perhaps more radical step. Instead of saying that consciousness is an illusion, or that it is something separate from the physical world, this view suggests something else entirely. That consciousness is fundamental, that it is not something that appears only in complex systems like brains, but something that is present in some form at the very base of reality. This idea is often called panpsychism. It does not claim that everything is conscious in the way humans are. A rock does not have thoughts, memories, or a sense of self. But it suggests that even the simplest forms of matter may have some very basic form of experience. Not something rich or detailed, but something minimal, a kind of inner aspect. To make this a little more intuitive, consider something like temperature. Every object has a temperature. A cup of tea, a stone, the air around you, all have it. But the temperature of a stone is not the same as the warmth of tea. It exists on a spectrum. In a similar way, panpsychism suggests that consciousness may exist on a spectrum, that the brain does not create it from nothing, but organizes it, shapes it, brings it together into the rich, unified experience you are having right now. In this view, the brain is less like a factory and more like a conductor. It does not produce the music, it coordinates it, brings separate elements into harmony. And this idea has a quiet advantage. It bridges the gap we've been exploring. If consciousness is already present in some form at the fundamental level, then we do not need to explain how it suddenly appears from purely physical processes. We only need to understand how it becomes more complex, more integrated, more vivid. Now, none of these paths is without challenges. Illusionism asks us to question the reality of experience itself. Dualism asks us to explain how two different kinds of reality interact. Panpsychism asks us to rethink what we mean by the basic nature of the world. Each one stretches our intuition in a different way. And at this point in our journey, there is no need to choose between them. You can simply hold them, gently, side by side, like three different maps of the same landscape, each highlighting something, each leaving something out. What matters is not deciding too quickly, but noticing how each perspective reshapes the question. Because once we begin to see consciousness not as a simple byproduct, but as something that might be woven into the fabric of reality itself, another question naturally begins to emerge. If consciousness is fundamental, then how does it come together in systems like the brain? How does it move from something simple to something as rich and continuous as your own experience, and that is where our exploration turns next, toward a theory that attempts to answer exactly that question, not by removing consciousness, but by measuring how deeply it is woven together. As those three gentle paths rest side by side, the idea that consciousness might be an illusion or something separate or something fundamental, we can take a slow step into the third possibility, not as a claim to accept, but as a landscape to explore. The suggestion is simple, though it may feel unfamiliar at first. What if consciousness is not something that appears only in brains, but something that is present in some quiet form, everywhere? This view is often called panpsychism, a long word but a soft idea. It does not mean that everything is conscious in the way you are. It does not suggest that stones are thinking or that rivers are making decisions. Instead, it proposes something much more subtle, that even the simplest parts of reality might have a very faint, almost minimal kind of inner presence. Not thoughts, not memories, not a sense of self, just a basic something it is like to be that thing. To approach this gently, it can help to think in terms of familiar qualities. Take something like warmth. Every object has a temperature. A warm cup of tea, a cool breeze, a stone lying in the shade. They all exist along a spectrum. Some are warmer, some cooler, but none are entirely outside the scale. Now imagine if consciousness were something like that. Not identical, of course, but similar in the sense that it might exist in degrees. A simple system might have a very faint, almost undetectable form of experience. A more complex system, like a brain, might have a rich, layered, continuous experience. The difference would not be in kind, but in complexity and organization. In this view, the brain does not create consciousness from nothing. It gathers it, shapes it, brings together many small, simple elements into a unified whole. Like a choir made of many voices, each voice on its own is quiet, limited, simple, but when they come together, something new emerges. Harmony, depth, a single, flowing piece of music. And perhaps your experience, the sense of being a unified self moving through time, is something like that. Not a single voice, but a composition. Now, at first, this idea can feel a little strange. It asks us to imagine that the inner aspect of reality, the part we know directly as experience, might not begin with us, that it might be present in some form all the way down. But there is a quiet reason why some thinkers take this idea seriously. It offers a way of addressing the gap we explored earlier, because if consciousness is already present at the most basic level, then we do not need to explain how it suddenly appears from purely physical processes. We only need to explain how it becomes organized, how it becomes integrated, how it forms the kind of continuous, coherent experience you're having right now. This shift from creation to organization is subtle but important. It changes the question from how does the brain produce consciousness to how does the brain bring together simpler forms of experience into a unified whole? And once the question is framed this way, new possibilities begin to open. You can think, for example, about the difference between scattered sounds and a melody. If you hear random notes played without coordination, they remain separate, disconnected. But when those same notes are arranged in a particular pattern, something changes. They become music. Not because anything new was added, but because the relationship between the parts became structured in a certain way. In a similar way, the brain might be organizing something that is already there, bringing together many small processes into a single flowing experience. Now, this idea leads to a natural question. If consciousness is everywhere, even in very simple systems, then why does our experience feel so unified? Why do we not feel like a collection of many small parts? Why do we feel like a single continuous self? This is sometimes called the combination problem. How do many small experiences combine into one larger experience? It is a challenging question, and there is no simple answer. But it points us towards something important, that the key may lie not just in the presence of consciousness, but in how it is connected, how different parts of a system interact, share information, and form a whole. And this brings us gently toward a more specific idea, a way of thinking about consciousness, not just as something present, but as something that depends on the degree of integration within a system, the extent to which its parts are woven together, not loosely connected, but deeply interdependent. This idea has been explored in modern neuroscience, and it attempts to give a more precise shape to the intuition we've just been following, that consciousness is not simply on or off, but something that can vary depending on how a system is organized. And as we move forward, we will explore this idea more carefully, not in terms of symbols or equations, but through images and examples that can be felt rather than calculated. For now, you can simply rest with the possibility that your experience, the richness of your thoughts, the continuity of your awareness may not be something that appeared suddenly in the universe, but something that has been quietly present in simpler forms all along, gathered, refined, brought together into the gentle unified flow you call your mind. As the thought lingers that consciousness might be present in simple forms and then gathered into something richer within the brain, a natural question begins to take shape. What makes that gathering possible? What allows many small pieces to become one continuous experience? Because when you pause and notice your own awareness, it does not feel scattered. It does not feel like a collection of separate moments or fragments. It feels unified. There is a sense of, this is happening to me, even as many different things are present at once. Sounds, sensations, thoughts, memories, all woven together into a single flow. So how does that happen? One gentle way to approach this is through the idea of integration, not as a technical term to memorize, but as something you already understand in everyday life. Imagine for a moment a group of musicians. Each one is playing their own part. A violin here, a piano there, perhaps a soft rhythm in the background. If they are not coordinated, if each musician plays independently without listening to the others, the result is noise, separate sounds disconnected, each existing on its own. But when they begin to listen to one another, when their timing aligns, when their notes complement each other, something changes. The sounds become music, a single piece, flowing smoothly, even though it is made of many parts. And the key difference is not the number of notes, but the way they are connected, the depth of their integration. In a similar way, some scientists have suggested that consciousness may depend on how tightly the parts of a system are woven together, not just that there are many elements, but that they interact in a rich, interdependent way. One of the researchers who explored this idea is Giulio Tononi, who proposed a framework often referred to as integrated information theory. The name may sound technical, but the core intuition is quite gentle. A system becomes more conscious as its parts become more deeply interconnected, as they share information, influence one another, and form a unified whole. You can think of it like a conversation. If many people are speaking but no one is listening, there is no shared understanding. But if each person hears the others, responds, adapts and contributes, something new emerges, a collective flow of meaning, not owned by any single voice, but arising from the interaction between them. In this view, the brain is not simply a collection of separate processes. It is a network where different regions constantly exchange information, shaping and reshaping the overall pattern. And when this exchange reaches a certain level of richness and coherence, a unified experience appears. Not because something new was added, but because the connections became deep enough to support it. Now, there is a small detail in this idea that is often expressed using a symbol, something called phi, which is meant to represent the degree of integration in a system. But we do not need to think of it as a symbol. Instead, we can imagine it as a kind of measure of togetherness, a way of asking, how much do the parts of this system truly depend on one another? If the parts can be separated easily, if each can function on its own without affecting the others, then the level of integration is low. And according to this idea, the level of consciousness would also be low. But if the parts are deeply interwoven, if changing one part affects many others, and the system cannot be divided without losing its structure, then the level of integration is high. And with that, the richness of experience increases. This helps explain something we touched on earlier: why your experience feels like one continuous whole. Because the processes in your brain are not isolated. They are constantly interacting, forming a web of connections that supports a unified perspective. It also helps explain why certain states, like deep sleep or anesthesia, reduce or even remove conscious experience. In those states, the patterns of interaction in the brain become less integrated. Signals still exist, but they are not woven together in the same way. The orchestra is still there, but the coordination fades, and with it, the music disappears. Now, it is important to be gentle with this idea. It does not claim to solve the entire mystery of consciousness. It does not fully explain why integration should be accompanied by experience. The hard problem, the question of why anything feels like anything, still remains. But what it offers is a way of connecting structure and experience more closely. A way of seeing how the organization of a system might shape the quality of awareness. And when we combine this with the earlier idea that consciousness might be fundamental, we arrive at a very interesting picture. Perhaps simple forms of experience exist at the base level of reality, and as systems become more integrated, these simple elements are brought together into richer, more unified forms, like threads woven into fabric, or droplets forming a stream. The brain, in this view, becomes a kind of gathering place, not the origin of consciousness, but a structure that allows it to take on a particular shape, a particular flow, a particular sense of self. And this brings us back once again to the idea of the brain not as a generator, but as an organizer, a conductor, rather than a composer. It does not create the music from nothing, it brings it into coherence. And as we rest with this image, another question begins to appear. If the brain organizes consciousness, then what is it organizing it from? Where does the signal come from? Is it something that exists independently, waiting to be shaped? Or is it something that arises through deeper processes we have not yet fully understood? To explore that, we will move into a part of science that feels, at first, a little unfamiliar. A place where the boundaries between observer and observed begin to soften, where the act of noticing something may play a role in what becomes real. But for now, you can simply rest with the idea of integration, the quiet weaving together of parts into a whole, the gentle emergence of unity from connection, and the possibility that your experience, this continuous flow of awareness, is not a single thing, but harmony. As the idea of integration gently settles, the sense that your experience may be a kind of harmony formed by deeply connected processes, we can take a quiet step into a different corner of science, a place where certainty softens, where the world, instead of being fixed and solid, begins to feel a little more fluid. This is the realm of quantum physics. Now, there is no need to think of this as something distant or complicated. We're not here to solve equations or follow detailed calculations. Instead, we can approach it the same way we've approached everything else, through simple images and a gentle sense of curiosity. At the smallest scales of reality, things do not behave the way we expect. Objects do not always have a single definite state. Instead, they seem to exist in a range of possibilities, not one outcome, but many. You can imagine it like a coin spinning in the air. Before it lands, we might say it is neither fully heads nor fully tails. It carries both possibilities at once in a kind of suspended state. In everyday life, the coin eventually lands. It becomes one thing or the other. But in the quantum world, something stranger seems to happen. Systems can remain in this state of multiple possibilities until a measurement is made, and then suddenly a single outcome appears, not gradually, but in a way that feels almost like a quiet decision. One possibility becomes real, the others fade away. This shift, from many possibilities to one actual result, is often described as something that happens when a system is observed or measured. Now, the word observation here can be a little misleading. It does not necessarily mean a human looking at something with their eyes. It can mean any interaction that brings about a definite outcome. But still, there is something unusual about it, because before this interaction, the system does not seem to have a single, well-defined state. It is described instead as a collection of possibilities. And this leads to a gentle but intriguing question. What role does observation play? Why does the act of measuring, of interacting, seem to bring about a definite reality? To make this a little more tangible, imagine you are listening to a piece of music that has not yet been fully composed. Not a finished song, but a set of possible melodies. As long as it remains unwritten, the music could unfold in many different ways. There are countless paths it might take, but the moment a note is chosen, a direction begins, the possibilities narrow, a single version of the song starts to emerge. In a similar way, quantum systems seem to move from openness into specificity, from many possible states into one experience reality. And while physicists have developed very precise ways of predicting the probabilities of different outcomes, the deeper question, why a particular outcome appears at all, remains quietly open. Now, it is important to move gently here. There are many interpretations of quantum physics, and not all of them place special importance on observation in the same way. Some describe this transition as a natural part of physical interaction, without needing to involve anything beyond the system itself. Others leave room for a more subtle role. What matters for our exploration is not choosing between these interpretations, but noticing the shape of the mystery. That at the smallest scales, reality does not seem to be fixed in the way we once imagined. It is not simply a collection of objects with definite properties, waiting to be discovered. It is something more fluid, more open, something that becomes definite in the context of interaction. And this has a quiet resonance with what we've been exploring about consciousness. Because earlier, we saw that experience, the feeling of being aware, does not sit neatly within physical descriptions. It is not something we can point to or locate. And now, in this different domain, we find that even the physical world itself may not be as solid and well-defined as it appears. Instead, it seems to carry a kind of potential, a range of possibilities that become specific only under certain conditions. This does not mean that consciousness creates reality. That would be too strong, too sudden a leap. But it opens a space for a softer question. Could consciousness be related in some way to this transition? To the movement from possibility into experience? Again, there is no need to answer. we can simply notice how the ideas begin to echo one another. On one side, we have the brain, shaping and integrating experience. On another, we have the quantum world, where outcomes are not fixed until interaction occurs. Both point toward a reality that is less rigid than it first appears, less like a set of solid objects, and more like a process, a gentle unfolding. And as we sit with this, another thought begins to form. If observation, if interaction, plays such a subtle role in bringing about definite outcomes, then what exactly is doing the observing? What stands at the end of this chain of interactions? Is it just more physical processes, passing signals along like a series of falling dominoes? Or is there something else? Something that does not fit entirely within that chain? This question leads us toward the next step of our journey. Not deeper into complexity, but deeper into simplicity, toward a quiet image, a line of dominoes stretching out in sequence, each one tipping the next, and somewhere at the very beginning, or perhaps just beyond the line, something that starts it all. For now, you can simply rest with the feeling of openness, the sense that reality, at its most fundamental level, may not be as fixed as it seems, that it may hold possibilities, gently waiting to become actual, and that your own experience, this quiet awareness, may be connected to that unfolding in ways we're only beginning to understand. As the image of possibilities gently narrowing into a single outcome lingers, we can follow that thread just a little further, not into complexity but into a quieter kind of curiosity. Because if reality, at its smallest scales, does not settle into a definite state until some form of interaction takes place, then a natural question begins to form. What exactly completes that interaction? Where does the chain end? To explore this, imagine once more a line of dominoes. Each one stands upright, waiting. When the first falls, it nudges the next, and that one nudges the next. A smooth, continuous sequence of motion, each step explained by the one before it. You can follow the chain as far as you like. From one domino to the next, the explanation always seems complete. Now imagine extending this image into the physical world. A particle interacts with another particle. That interaction triggers a change in a measuring device. The device sends signals into a larger system. Those signals travel through wires, through circuits, through layers of physical processes, and eventually the chain reaches the brain. Neurons respond. Patterns of activity emerge. Signals move through networks, forming complex interactions. At each step, we can describe what is happening. One event leading to another. One physical process giving rise to the next. But here is where the quiet question returns. At the very end of this chain, something is experienced. There is a moment of awareness, a sense that something has been observed. And this experience, this simple, undeniable presence, is not described in the same way as the physical steps that came before it. We can trace the signals, we can map the pathways, but the experience itself, the feeling of knowing that something has happened, is different. It does not appear as another domino in the chain. It is not just another physical interaction. It is something we encounter directly from within. This leads to a subtle idea explored by thinkers like John von Neumann. He suggested that if we follow the chain of physical interactions far enough, through particles, through instruments, through the brain, we still do not arrive at something that fully accounts for the act of observation. The chain can always be extended, each step explained by another physical step. But the experience of observation, the moment in which something becomes known, does not seem to fit neatly into that sequence. It is as if the chain describes everything that happens, except the one thing that allows it to be experienced. And this does not mean that consciousness is separate in a dramatic or mystical sense. It simply means that within this framework, it does not appear as just another link in the chain. It stands in a different relation, not pushing the dominoes, but somehow present when they fall. To make this a little more intuitive, imagine watching a line of dominoes fall in a quiet room. You can describe the motion perfectly, the angle of each piece, the timing, the transfer of energy from one to the next. But there is also the fact that you are seeing it, that the sequence is appearing in your awareness, and that presence, the simple act of witnessing, is not captured by the description of the motion itself. It is not something you can point to among the dominoes. It is the context in which the whole sequence is known. Now, it is important to be gentle here. This idea does not prove that consciousness exists outside the physical world. It does not require us to abandon what we know about the brain or about physics. What it suggests is something quieter, that there may be aspects of reality, particularly the aspect we know as experience, that are not fully described by chains of physical causation alone, that even a complete account of interactions may leave something out, and that something is the simple fact of awareness, the feeling that something is happening, the presence in which events appear. This brings us back in a soft and circular way to where we began, the question of where the mind is. Because if consciousness does not appear as a location within the chain, if it is not simply another event among events, then it may not belong to the same category at all. It may not be something that exists in space in the usual sense. It may be something more like a background, or a condition, or a field of presence, not something that moves or changes in the same way as objects, but something that allows change to be known. And when we hold this idea alongside what we explored earlier, the possibility that the brain shapes and organizes experience, we arrive at a gentle but powerful image, the brain as part of the chain, a complex dynamic system of interactions, and consciousness as the aspect of reality in which that chain is experienced, not outside in the sense of being separate, but not inside in the sense of being contained, something that does not sit neatly in either category, like the silence that holds a piece of music, or the stillness that allows movement to be noticed. Now this may feel abstract, but it can also be felt directly, in a very simple way. Right now, there is experience, sounds perhaps, sensations, the rhythm of these words, all of it appearing, and at the same time there is the quiet fact that it's appearing to you, that there is awareness, and that awareness is not something you can place within the scene. It does not sit beside the sounds or behind the sensations. It is simply there, the condition in which everything else becomes known. And as we rest with that, another possibility begins to emerge. If consciousness is not fully contained within the chain of physical events, then perhaps the brain is not producing it in the way we usually imagine. Perhaps it is interacting with it, shaping it, bringing it into a particular form, like an instrument responding to a deeper pattern. And this brings us naturally to the next step, a softer, more familiar image, one that takes the abstract idea of interaction and turns it into something you can hear almost immediately. A radio, quietly tuning through frequencies, not creating the music, but finding it. As the image of the dominoes gently fades, the sense of a chain of events unfolding, yet somehow always appearing within awareness, we can return to something more familiar, the brain, but this time with a slightly different lens. Because up until now, the most common way of thinking about the brain has been quite simple. The brain produces consciousness. Just as a flame produces light or a generator produces electricity, the brain is often imagined as the source of experience, and this idea is not without reason. As we've seen, changing the brain changes experience. Injury, chemicals, sleep, attention, all of these alter the patterns of activity within the brain, and with them, the qualities of experience shift as well. It feels natural, then, to say that the brain creates the mind. But as we move gently through everything we've explored, the gap between structure and experience, the question of location, the subtle role of observation, a quieter possibility begins to take shape. What if the brain does not create consciousness, but shapes it? This is not a dramatic rejection of what we know. It is a soft shift in emphasis. Instead of thinking of the brain as a source, we can imagine it as an interface, something that receives, filters, and organizes experience. To make this more intuitive, consider something simple: a pair of tinted glasses. If you put them on, the world changes. Colors shift. Light softens or deepens. Certain details become more prominent, while others fade into the background. Now, if you were to wear these glasses from the very beginning, if you'd never seen the world without them, you might assume that the colors you perceive are simply how things are. You might say, this is the real world. But in truth, what you are seeing is the world as filtered through a particular lens. The glasses do not create the light, they shape how it appears, and in a quiet way, the brain may function similarly. It does not necessarily create the raw presence of experience, but it filters it, organizes it, transforms it into the structured, meaningful world you perceive. Now, this idea might seem a little abstract, so we can approach it from another angle. Think about how different states of the brain change experience. When you're fully awake, your awareness feels continuous and clear. When you're dreaming, the world becomes fluid, imaginative, sometimes illogical. When you're in deep sleep, experience fades into something almost absent, and under anesthesia, awareness seems to disappear entirely. Each of these states corresponds to different patterns of activity in the brain. But what changes is not just the presence or absence of experience, it is the structure of experience, the way it unfolds, the way it is organized. This suggests that the brain plays a crucial role in shaping how consciousness appears. But shaping is not the same as creating. A sculptor shapes clay into a form, but the clay is already there. A lens shapes light into an image, but the light exists independently. In the same way, the brain might be shaping something more fundamental, something that does not originate within it, but is expressed through it. Now, it is important to move gently here. This idea does not deny the importance of the brain. Far from it. The brain is clearly essential. Without it, the specific form of human experience, the continuity, the richness, the sense of self, would not exist in the way we know it. But the question is not whether the brain matters. It is what kind of role it plays. Is it a creator, or is it a mediator? To explore this further, imagine listening to music through a set of headphones. If the headphones are high quality, the sound is clear, balanced, immersive. If they are damaged, the sound may distort, become muffled, or disappear altogether. Now, if you only ever experienced music through these headphones, you might think that the headphones are producing the music. After all, when they are removed or broken, the music is gone. But in reality, the music is coming from elsewhere. The headphones are simply translating it into a form you can hear. In a similar way, the brain may be translating a deeper aspect of reality into the experience we call consciousness, not producing it, but making it accessible. Now, this analogy is not perfect. No analogy is. But it helps us soften the assumption that the brain must be the origin of experience. It opens the possibility that the relationship is more like a conversation than a one-way process. And this idea has appeared in different forms across both science and philosophy. Sometimes it is called a filter theory, sometimes a receiver model, sometimes an interface. The names are not as important as the intuition behind them, that the brain might be shaping, limiting, and organizing consciousness, rather than generating it from nothing. And if that is the case, then many of the observations we've made begin to take on a slightly different meaning. The fact that brain damage alters experience does not necessarily mean the brain creates experience. It may mean that the brain is altering the way experience is filtered or expressed. The fact that anesthesia reduces awareness does not necessarily mean it eliminates consciousness entirely. It may mean that the brain's ability to organize and present experience has been disrupted. These are subtle shifts in interpretation, but they change the landscape of the question from how does the brain create consciousness to how does the brain shape the form that consciousness takes? And as we sit with this idea, another image begins to emerge, one that brings everything we've explored into a single simple picture, not of a brain producing something, but of a system tuning into something, finding it, adjusting to it, like a quiet device, turning slowly through a range of possibilities until something clear begins to come through. As the idea gently settles that the brain may be shaping experience rather than creating it, a softer image begins to come into focus, not as a claim, but as a way of seeing. Imagine, for a moment, an old radio, the kind with a dial that turns slowly, clicking faintly as it moves from one frequency to another. At first, there is only static, a soft hiss, scattered and unfocused. Then, as the dial shifts just slightly, something begins to emerge. A voice, distant at first, then clearer. Music, rising gently out of the noise. The radio has not created the music. It has found it, tuned into it, brought it into a form that can be heard, and if the radio is adjusted, if the dial moves or the internal components change, the sound changes as well. It may become clearer, richer, or distorted, fragmented, even silent. But the change in sound does not mean the signal itself has vanished. It means the way the signal is being received has changed. Now, this image is not meant to be taken too literally. The brain is not a radio in a physical sense, but as an analogy, it offers something gentle and useful, a way of imagining the relationship between brain and consciousness that does not depend on creation alone. In this view, the brain is a kind of tuning system. It interacts with a deeper layer of reality and brings certain patterns into experience. Not all possibilities at once, but a specific range, a particular perspective. You. Now, this may sound abstract, but there are small hints of this idea even in everyday experience. Think about attention. At any given moment, there is far more happening around you than you're aware of. Sounds, sensations, subtle details. Most of them pass unnoticed. But when your attention shifts, something changes. A sound you didn't notice becomes clear. A sensation you ignored becomes vivid. It is as if your awareness has tuned itself, selecting one signal from many. And while this is not the same as tuning a radio, it carries a similar feeling of filtering, of selecting, of bringing something into focus. The brain, in this sense, may be doing something like this all the time, not just selecting from external signals, but shaping the very structure of experience itself. Now, let's return for a moment to something we observed earlier. When the brain is altered, experience changes. Under anesthesia, awareness fades. In dreaming, it becomes fluid. In waking life, it feels stable and continuous. From the usual perspective, this suggests that the brain is producing these states. But from the perspective we are gently exploring now, it suggests something slightly different, that the brain is adjusting its tuning, changing the way it interacts with whatever underlies experience, like a radio moving between stations, sometimes clear, sometimes distorted, sometimes silent. And yet, the silence itself does not necessarily mean that nothing exists, only that nothing is being received in that moment. Again, this is not something we can prove in a simple way. It is a shift in how we interpret what we observe, a change in perspective. Now, there is a sentence that captures this idea in a very simple way. It may sound almost obvious at first, but if you sit with it, it begins to open. The music is not inside the speaker. When you listen to a song, it feels as though the sound is coming from the device in front of you, and in a sense, it is. But the source of the music, the pattern, the structure, the signal, exists beyond the speaker itself. The speaker is a medium, a translator, a way of making something present. And perhaps, in a similar way, the brain is not the place where consciousness is stored. It is the place where consciousness becomes structured, experienced, brought into the form of a world. Now, this idea can be taken too far if we are not careful. It does not mean that consciousness exists as a separate thing floating somewhere outside the brain. It does not require us to imagine signals travelling through space in a literal sense. Instead, it invites us to consider that the relationship between brain and mind may be more like a process of interaction than a simple act of production. That the brain participates in consciousness, shapes it, limits it, perhaps even stabilizes it, but does not necessarily generate it from nothing. And this perspective has an interesting consequence. It suggests that what you experience as your mind may be a particular expression of something more general, a localized pattern, a specific tuning, like a single station among many possible frequencies. And if that is true, then your experience is not just something happening inside your head, it is something happening through your brain. A subtle but important difference, not contained but expressed, not produced but shaped. And as we rest with this idea, the boundaries we usually take for granted begin to soften. The boundary between inside and outside, between self and world, between observer and observed. Because if the brain is not a container, but an interface, then the world you experience may not be entirely out there, nor entirely in here. It may be something that arises in the relationship between the two, like an image on a screen, not in the screen alone, and not in the signal alone, but in the meeting between them. And this brings us gently toward an even wider view, because if experience arises through interaction, and if the structures we perceive, space, objects, distance, are part of that experience, then we can begin to ask a deeper question. What if space itself is part of the interface? What if the very stage on which everything appears is not as fundamental as it seems? There is no need to answer. You can simply let the idea rest, like a faint signal just beginning to come into clarity, something not yet fully understood, but quietly present. As the image of a radio quietly tuning into a signal begins to settle, another slightly wider question starts to emerge. If your experience is shaped by the way your brain interacts with reality, then what about the stage on which that experience appears? The space around you, the sense of distance between things, the feeling that objects exist out there, arranged in a vast three-dimensional world. We tend to take this for granted. Space feels solid, continuous, and unquestionable. But in modern physics, there are hints, quiet, subtle hints, that space itself might not be as fundamental as it seems, that it may not be the deepest layer of reality, but something that emerges from something else. Now, this idea can sound very abstract at first, so it helps to approach it gently through a simple image. Imagine a flat surface, like a sheet of paper. On that surface, you draw patterns, lines, shapes, textures, everything arranged in 2 dimensions. Now imagine that somehow those patterns create the appearance of depth, of a 3rd dimension. Objects seem to rise out of the page. Distances seem to stretch into space, even though at the base level everything exists on a flat surface. This may sound like a trick of perspective, and in a way it is. But in physics, there is an idea, often called the holographic principle, that suggests something loosely similar might be happening in the universe, not in a literal sense of drawings on paper, but in the sense that the 3-dimensional world we experience could be a kind of projection, arising from deeper, more fundamental relationships. The details of this idea can become very technical, but the intuition behind it is surprisingly gentle. What we perceive as space may not be the most basic layer of reality. It may be something that emerges, something that appears, as a result of deeper patterns. And if that is true, then something interesting follows. The question, where is something located, becomes less straightforward, because location itself depends on space. And if space is not fundamental, then location may not be fundamental either. This brings us back quietly to the question we asked much earlier. Where is your mind? If space is part of the structure of experience, part of the interface through which reality appears, then asking where consciousness is located may be like asking where a character in a dream exists. Inside the dream, everything has a position. There are places, distances, directions. But the dream itself does not exist in that same space. It is not located within the landscape it creates. It is the condition that allows that landscape to appear. Now, this does not mean that the world is unreal or that nothing exists. It simply suggests that the way we experience the world, the spatial structure, the sense of objects and distances, may be a representation, a way of organizing information, a kind of interface. And this idea becomes even more intriguing when we connect it to what we explored earlier about the brain. If the brain is shaping experience, filtering and organizing it, then the space you perceive may also be part of that shaping. Not something entirely separate from consciousness, but something that appears within it. To make this a little more intuitive, imagine using a computer. On the screen, you see icons, small images representing files, folders, applications. You can move them, arrange them, interact with them. They appear to exist in a kind of space. But that space, the desktop, is not the underlying reality of the computer. It is a simplified interface, a way of presenting complex information in a form that is easy to use. The actual processes, the data, the electrical patterns, exist at a different level, hidden from direct view. In a similar way, the space you experience may be a kind of interface, a way of organizing the underlying structure of reality into something that can be perceived, navigated, and understood. Now again, this is not something we need to take as a final truth. It is a possibility, a way of softening the assumption that space is the ultimate container of everything. Because if space is part of the interface, then the idea that your mind must be located somewhere within that space becomes less certain. It may be that consciousness is not in space, but that space is in consciousness, not in a literal sense, but in the sense that the experience of space arises within awareness. Just as the landscape of a dream arises within the mind of the dreamer, this shift is subtle, but it changes the direction of the question. Instead of asking, where is consciousness within the universe? We begin to ask, how does the universe appear within consciousness? And while this may feel like a reversal, it is not meant to replace one certainty with another. It is meant to open a space, a gentle flexibility in how we think about reality. Because as we move further, we will encounter ideas that suggest our perception of the world may not be a direct window into reality, but something more like a carefully constructed view, a way of interacting with what is there without fully revealing its deeper nature. And in that sense, the space you see around you, the room, the objects, the distances, may be less like a final picture and more like a map, useful, reliable, but not identical to the territory itself. For now, you can simply rest with the possibility that the world you experience is shaped. That space itself may be part of that shaping, and that the question of where your mind is may be less about finding a location and more about understanding the nature of the stage on which everything appears. As the idea gently settles that space itself may be part of an interface, something shaped rather than absolute, we can take one more quiet step into how that interface might work, because even if the world feels solid, structured and consistent, there is a growing suggestion, both in science and philosophy, that what you perceive is not a direct copy of reality. It is something more like a translation, a carefully constructed view. To explore this, we can turn to the work of Hoffman, who has spent many years thinking about perception in a slightly unusual way. His idea begins with a simple observation. In everyday life, perception is not about truth. It is about usefulness. Imagine a small creature moving through a forest. It does not need to understand the true nature of atoms or the deep structure of space-time. It only needs to know what helps it survive, which plants are safe, which sounds signal danger, where to move, and where to stay still. If its perception were perfectly accurate in a detailed scientific sense, it might actually be overwhelmed. Too much information, too many layers, too much complexity to act quickly. Instead, evolution tends to favour something else: simplicity, efficiency. A way of presenting the world that is not necessarily true in every detail, but is useful. Now, to make this more tangible, imagine again the desktop of a computer. On the screen, you see icons, a small folder, a document, a trash bin. Each one has a simple shape, a clear function, an easy way to interact. But none of these icons resemble the underlying reality of the computer. They do not show you the electrical patterns, the streams of data, the complex processes happening beneath the surface, and yet they are extremely useful. They allow you to navigate the system without needing to understand its full complexity. In a similar way, your perception may be presenting you with a set of icons, objects, colours, shapes, all arranged in a spatial layout that feels natural and intuitive. But this layout may not be a literal picture of reality as it is. It may be a simplified interface, a way of interacting with something deeper. Now, this does not mean that the world is false, or that nothing exists. It simply suggests that what you see is not the full story, that there is a distinction between appearance and underlying structure. And this idea can be felt in small ways, even in everyday experience. Consider colour, the redness of a rose, the blue of the sky. These qualities feel vivid, immediate, almost undeniable. But physics tells us that colour in itself is not a property that exists out there in the world. What exists are patterns of light, waves of different lengths interacting with your eyes. The colour you see is a translation, a way your brain presents that information. Now, the translation is reliable. It helps you navigate the world. But it is not identical to the underlying process. And if this is true for something as simple as colour, it may also be true in deeper ways for the structure of space, objects, and even the sense of separation between things. Your experience may be a kind of interface, designed, shaped, and refined to help you interact with reality, not to reveal it completely. This brings us back softly to the idea we explored earlier, that the brain may be acting as a filter or a receiver, not showing you everything, but selecting, shaping, and presenting a particular view. And if that is the case, then the world you experience, the room around you, the objects within it, the sense of distance and location may be part of the presentation, not a direct copy of reality, but a meaningful arrangement, a way of making something vast and complex, usable. Now, this idea has a quiet implication. If perception is an interface, then what we take to be out there may not be entirely separate from how we experience it. The boundary between observer and observed begins to soften, not because they are the same thing, but because they are connected through the process of perception itself. The world appears to you in a particular way because of how your system is structured, and your system is part of the world, a loop, a gentle interplay. Now, this does not mean that everything is subjective or that reality is entirely dependent on the mind. There is still something there, something that gives rise to the patterns we perceive, but the way it appears, the form it takes in your experience, may be shaped by the interface you're using, your brain, your senses, your mode of perception. And this brings us to a subtle shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "Is what I see real?" we can ask, "What kind of reality does my perception allow me to see?" Not a denial of reality, but an acknowledgement that we are always seeing through a lens that simplifies, organizes, and sometimes hides as much as it reveals. And as we rest with this idea, the earlier questions begin to connect. If perception is an interface, if space is part of that interface, if the brain is shaping the form of experience, then consciousness, the field in which all of this appears, may not be something confined within the interface at all. It may be more fundamental, something that is not limited to the particular view you are seeing, but expressed through it. Now, again, there is no need to draw a final conclusion. You can simply notice how the pieces begin to align. The brain as a filter, perception as an interface, space as a constructed stage, and consciousness as the quiet presence in which all of it unfolds. From here, the journey becomes more personal, because once we begin to question the nature of perception, another question naturally follows. What exactly is the self that is perceiving? Is it just the information being processed? Or is there something more continuous? Something that persists through change? To explore that, we will turn to a simple thought experiment, one that gently asks what remains when everything that can be copied is copied, and whether the essence of you can be reduced to information alone. As the idea gently settles that perception may be a kind of interface, a carefully shaped view rather than a direct window into reality, another more personal question begins to rise. What is the self that is having this experience? Not the body, not the brain as an object we can describe, but the quiet sense of I that seems to persist from moment to moment. To explore this, we can turn to a simple thought experiment. Imagine a machine, not a loud or complex one, but something quiet, precise, almost invisible in how it works. This machine has a very unusual ability. It can scan your entire body, including your brain, in perfect detail, every cell, every connection, every pattern of activity, and then, in an instant, it creates an exact copy. Not an approximation, but a perfect duplicate. The same structure, the same memories, the same patterns of thought. From the outside, there would be no difference. The copy would speak like you, remember what you remember, respond in the same way. If someone were to meet it, they would not be able to tell that anything had changed. Now imagine that, at the moment the copy is made, something else happens. Your original body is gently turned off. Not violently, not abruptly, but quietly, like a light fading, and the copy continues. From the outside, it appears as though you have simply continued living. There is no interruption, no visible break. But now comes the quiet question. From the inside, what happened? Did you continue in the copy? Or did your experience end while something identical carried on? At first, it may feel as though the answer should be simple. If everything about you, your memories, your personality, your patterns of thought, has been preserved, then perhaps nothing has changed. Perhaps the self is just information, a pattern that can be copied and continued. But if you sit with the question a little longer, something subtle begins to appear. Because your experience right now is not just a collection of information, it is a continuous flow, a sense of being here, moving from one moment to the next. There is a feeling of continuity, of presence, and this continuity does not seem to be captured entirely by structure. You can imagine the copy waking up, looking around and saying, "I am here," and from its perspective that would be true. But from your current perspective there is still a question. Would your awareness have moved into that copy? Or is awareness something that cannot be transferred in that way? Something that is not simply part of the pattern, but part of the process of being? To make this a little more tangible, consider a simple everyday experience. You fall asleep. At some point your awareness fades. Then, hours later, you wake up. And there is a sense that you have continued, that the same you is present again, even though there was a gap. But imagine instead that during that gap your brain was replaced with an exact copy, every detail preserved. From the outside, nothing would appear different, but would the continuity feel the same? Or would there be something missing? Something subtle, but essential? This is not a question with an easy answer, but it points toward an important idea. That identity may not be reducible to information alone, that the self is not just a pattern that can be copied, but something that involves a continuous thread of experience, a flow that cannot be paused and restarted without question. Now, this does not mean that the self is something separate or fixed. In fact, many traditions suggest that the sense of a stable self is itself a kind of construction, a story the brain tells to create coherence. And yet, even if the self is constructed, the experience of continuity remains, the sense that something is here, moment after moment, watching, feeling, being. And this brings us back, gently, to the idea we have been exploring throughout this journey. That consciousness may not be something that exists as a static object, not something you have, but something that is happening, a process, a flow. And if that is the case, then trying to copy the self as information may be a bit like trying to capture a flame by describing its shape. You can replicate the pattern, but the living process, the ongoing presence, may not transfer in the same way. This does not mean that continuity is mysterious in a supernatural sense. It simply means that it may depend on something more than structure alone, something tied to the unfolding of experience itself. And as we sit with this idea, another question begins to form. If the self is not just information, if it is not simply a pattern that can be copied, then what is it? Is it something that arises from the integration we explored earlier? Is it something shaped by the brain's filtering and tuning? Or is it something more fundamental, a localized expression of a deeper field of consciousness? Again, there is no need to decide. You can simply notice how the question opens, how it moves from something concrete into something more fluid, and how at each step the sense of you becomes a little less fixed and a little more like a process unfolding, a continuity rather than a thing. And this brings us gently toward the final step of our journey, a place where all the ideas we've explored about the brain, about perception, about reality itself begin to come together, not into a single answer, but into a quiet possibility that the consciousness you experience is not something contained within you, but something that you are participating in, a part of something larger, something that, in a very soft and simple way, is experiencing itself. As the question of continuity gently lingers, the sense that your experience is not just information, but a flowing presence that cannot be easily copied or transferred, we arrive softly at the edge of our journey, not a place of final answers, but a place where many threads begin to come together. Throughout this quiet exploration, we have moved through different layers of understanding. We began with a simple assumption that the mind is in the brain. It felt obvious, almost unquestionable, but as we looked more closely, that certainty began to soften. We saw that while the brain and the mind are deeply connected, that connection does not necessarily mean creation. That correlation, no matter how strong, does not fully explain experience. We explored the hard problem of consciousness, the question of why anything feels like anything at all. And we found that even a complete description of physical processes seems to leave something out: the feeling itself, the presence of awareness. We stepped into Mary's room and saw that knowing everything about the physical world does not guarantee knowing what it is like to experience it. We noticed that consciousness does not behave like an object in space. It has no clear location, no boundary we can point to. And so, the question of where it is began to dissolve. We looked at the structure of reality and saw that physics describes relationships, patterns and interactions, but not the inner nature of things. We explored the possibility that consciousness might be fundamental, not something that appears suddenly in complex systems, but something present in simpler forms throughout reality. We considered how integration, the deep interconnection of parts, might shape the richness of experience, how the brain, rather than creating consciousness, might organize it, like a conductor guiding a symphony. We stepped into the strange world of quantum physics, where reality itself seems to rest in possibilities, becoming definite only through interaction. And we followed the chain of events, noticing that the act of observation, the simple presence of awareness, does not fit neatly into that chain. We explored the idea of the brain as a filter, a receiver, like a radio tuning into a signal, not producing the music but bringing it into form. We questioned the nature of space, considering that it might not be the fundamental stage we imagine but something that emerges, part of an interface. And we looked at perception itself, seeing that it may not reveal reality as it is, but present a simplified, useful version of it. Finally, we turned inward, asking what the self really is, and whether it can be reduced to information alone. And through all of this, something quiet has been unfolding, a shift, not from one belief to another, but from certainty into openness. Now, at this final moment, we can hold a simple possibility, not as a conclusion, but as a gentle way of seeing. What if consciousness is not something you have? What if it is not located inside you, not produced by your brain, not confined to your body? What if, instead, it is something you're participating in, something that is already present and expressing itself through the form you call you? To make this a little more tangible, imagine the ocean. vast, continuous, moving in slow and subtle ways. Now imagine a wave. From a certain perspective, the wave looks like a separate thing. It rises, travels, and eventually fades. You could point to it, describe it, measure it. But the wave is not separate from the ocean. It is a pattern within it, a temporary expression of a larger process, and perhaps, in a very quiet way, your experience is similar. The sense of being an individual, a self, a mind, a center of awareness, may be like the shape of a wave, real, meaningful and distinct, but not separate from the deeper field in which it arises. In this view, consciousness is not something that begins with you. It is something that flows through you, something that takes on a particular form shaped by the structure of your brain, your body, your life, but not limited to it. Now this idea can be misunderstood if taken too strongly. It is not saying that you are literally the entire universe. It is not asking you to replace one rigid belief with another. Instead, it invites a softer perspective, that the boundary between you and the world may not be as sharp as it appears, that the awareness you experience may not be isolated, but connected in ways we do not yet fully understand. And there is something quietly comforting about this, because it shifts the feeling of being a separate observer, looking out at a distant world, into something more integrated, more continuous, more like participation than observation. The world is not just something you see. It is something you are part of, something that appears within the same field of awareness that you experience as yourself. And as this idea settles, there is no need to hold on to it tightly. You can let it remain open, a possibility, a gentle question that does not demand an answer. Because in the end, the goal of this journey was never to solve consciousness. It was to explore it, to feel its depth, its subtlety, its mystery. And perhaps to notice that the very thing we're trying to understand is already here, already present, in every sensation, every thought, every quiet moment of awareness. Not something hidden, but something so close, so immediate, that it often goes unnoticed. And so, as we come to the end of this exploration, you can simply rest in that presence. No need to define it, no need to locate it, just the quiet sense of being. And so, we've reached the end of tonight's exploration. Whether your eyes are still open or you're already floating somewhere between waking and dreaming, thank you for being part of this little journey. If you'd like to join me again for more gentle wanderings, you're always welcome to subscribe or share this with someone who could use a peaceful pause. Time has a way of slipping through our fingers, but here, in this quiet moment, it's just you and the soft hush of rest. Sleep peacefully wherever and whenever you may be, and